The term manifest destiny first came into use in the late 1830s and became more widely popular among expansionist Democrats during the Mexican War. Many Americans came to believe that it was the destiny of the United States to expand territorially across the entire North American continent, displacing both the Indians and the European powers that colonized but much of both North and South. Some Americans, such as philosopher Henry David Thoreau, believed American expansion, particularly in the war with Mexico in 1845, was unjust and placed the United States in the role of the aggressor. They argued that America's founders sought to create a peaceful republic and not a militaristic empire. This PowerPoint presentation will examine the expansion of the American empire across North America, the North American continent from the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783 to beginnings of the War for Southern Independence, more widely known as the Civil War in 1860. As a result of the 1783 Treaty of Paris, the newly independent United States of America found itself in possession of new unsettled land west of the Appalachian Mountains. Declared off limits to colonial settlers by the British Proclamation of 1763, this new land was now open to white settlement. As part of the Treaty of Paris that ended the war with Britain, the British government ceded the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River to the United States, with the northern border, with still British Canada, to be negotiated later. Initially, many of the newly independent states bordering this territory claimed the land lying to the west by merely extending the northern and southern borders to the Mississippi River. Thus, most of what is today Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and all of Kentucky, would be part of Virginia. States not having a border on the Appalachian Mountains, such as Massachusetts, objected to this plan, and the matter was eventually turned over to Congress for settlement. Congress eventually worked out a settlement known as the Northwest Ordinances of 1785 and 1787. Under the settlement, the original 13 states would cede or give up all claims to any land west of the Appalachian Mountains. The new territory would then be divided into territories to be administered by Congress until sufficient population had settled into the area to apply for formal statehood. The people living in the territory would then form a state government and apply to Congress for admission to the Confederation as a new state. The first state formed from the new territory was Kentucky, which was admitted to the Union as the 15th state in 1792. Vermont, which had seceded from New Hampshire and New York during the Revolutionary War, and which had for 14 years existed as an independent republic from 1777 to 1791, joined the Union 1 year earlier. As white American settlement moved west, one critical issue was transportation. Overland travel during the late 18th and early 19th century was extremely slow and difficult. A trip that today would take a day drive from, say, New York to Illinois would take weeks of traveling over rutted trails through often hostile Indian territory. In the north, the Great Lakes and the Erie Canal provided some with efficient and affordable transportation to the interior, but away from the lakes there was only the Mississippi River, which was controlled by the French, who had established control of the river's west bank and the key port city of New Orleans in present-day Louisiana, at the mouth of the river. In 1803, French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte offered to sell the United States its possessions in North America, which would almost double the size of the United States and give it full control of the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans. Facing war with its traditional foe, Great Britain, Napoleon was in need of cash and saw little value in hanging on to colonial possessions in America that he felt he would eventually lose anyway. U.S. President Thomas Jefferson worried that the U.S. Constitution gave neither him nor Congress any authority to purchase the territory, but in the end, political pressure from farmers wanting unfettered access to the Mississippi River and the use of the port of New Orleans convinced Jefferson to make the deal. France sold the U.S. what became known as the Louisiana Purchase for $15 million, and it was later organized into Louisiana Territory. As settlers moved into the new territory, it was later broken into smaller territories that later became new states. It is often called one of America's forgotten wars. It is indeed a war Americans probably prefer to forget. Most history books explain the war, if they explain it at all, as caused by British impressment of American sailors or caused by British aid to hostile Indians in the Northwest Territories. It is always the other country's fault. Many observers at the time, and many historians today, however, saw clearly that the real aim of the war was the conquest of Canada by the United States. The American revolutionaries had hoped the Canadians would join the fight for independence in 1776, but the British Canadians wanted no part of the war and remained loyal to Britain. Patriot forces attacked Canada in the early years of the Revolutionary War, but were repulsed by British and Canadian loyalists. America's Articles of Confederation also made provision for Canada to join the Confederation, but again the Canadians said no thank you. In 1812, Britain was busy fighting Napoleon's France and had no interest in war with the United States. It was the Americans who insisted on war. While American naval forces won some battles on the Great Lakes, the Americans failed in 2 attempts to invade Canada. The Americans expected the Canadians to greet them as liberators, but the Canadians fought back, successfully driving the Americans out. Once the British had finally defeated Napoleon in Europe, they then turned their full attention to the pesky Americans. In 1814, they sent a large force to the eastern seaboard and successfully occupied Washington, D.C., as American military forces fled. After burning the American capital to the ground and forcing Congress and President Madison to flee, the British moved on. America's national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, celebrates the fact that the British failed to take Fort McHenry near Baltimore, but the British had accomplished what they set out to do and teach the Americans a lesson. The British never had any intention of staying or reconquering America. In 1814, the pointlessness and futility of the war was becoming apparent to both the British and the Americans. The war ended in 1814 with a peace treaty that changed nothing. General Andrew Jackson's famous victory over the British at New Orleans actually occurred after the peace treaty had been signed and was as pointless as the war itself. America's borders remained as they were before the war. Canada remained part of the British Empire, and Britain and America settled their few remaining differences peacefully through negotiation, what they should have done in the first place. In 1821, the United States negotiated the purchase of Florida from Spain and settled the border between the United States and New Spain, which would shortly thereafter become the independent nation of Mexico. Many American settlers in Louisiana never accepted the treaty's provisions and continued to move west into the Mexican province of Coahuila and Tejas. The newly independent government of Mexico initially accepted these American settlers, provided that they become Mexican citizens, accept the Catholic religion, and refrain from bringing slaves into Mexico, with slavery being illegal in Mexico. Most of the American settlers had no intention of abiding by these conditions, and the Mexican government became increasingly irritated by the increasing numbers of illegal American immigrants who refused to assimilate to Mexican culture and abide by Mexican law. The irony here is that today Americans in the Southwest accuse the Mexicans of the same offenses, forgetting that this territory was once Mexican before the Americans invaded it via illegal immigration. In 1836, led mainly by the American immigrants but also by some native Mexicans, the Mexican province of Tejas y Coahuila declared independence from Mexico. By this time, the province was largely populated by American Mexican immigrants who did not share Mexico's culture or religion. They wanted not independence, but annexation to the United States of America. Mexico's government did not accept the separation of this province and sent a large military force under General Santa Anna to subdue the province. After defeating a small force of American Mexicans holed up in a border fortress known as the Alamo, Santa Anna was later defeated by a much larger force led by General Sam Houston at the Battle of San Jacinto. Though unable to control the province militarily, Mexico refused to formally recognize the new Republic of Texas. Mexico maintained that the newly declared independent Republic of Texas was still part of Mexico, and warned the United States that any attempt by the U.S. to incorporate Texas as a U.S. state would be considered an act of war against Mexico. In the U.S., anti-slavery forces in Congress also opposed annexation or statehood for Texas, since it was clear that Texas would enter the Union as a slave state and give the southern states more power within the Federation. Texas therefore existed as an independent nation-state, or the Lone Star Republic, from 1836 to 1845. In 1845, however, James K. Polk succeeded John Tyler as President of the United States. Polk and his supporters in Congress favored annexation and statehood for Texas. That same year, Congress agreed to admit Texas as a new state in the American Union. Though angry over the move, Mexico did not declare war against the United States. Mexico did, however, move troops into the area south of the Rio Grande River to prevent further American incursions into Mexican territory. Mexico actually claimed that the Nueces River, some 100 miles to the north, was the official border of its lost province, but it did not want to provoke a fight with the United States, which claimed that the Rio Grande was the border. Not satisfied with this, Polk then sent an emissary, John Slidell, to Mexico to try to arrange the purchase of California, but the Mexican government refused to even see Slidell. Polk took this refusal as an insult, and President Polk then ordered U.S. soldiers under General Zachary Taylor into the disputed territory between the Nueces and Rio Grande rivers. When Mexican forces reportedly fired on the U.S. forces, which from their point of view had invaded Mexican territory, Congress declared war on Mexico. The Mexican army was no match for U.S. forces, and Mexico City was occupied, and Mexico forced to accept humiliating terms in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. By the terms of the 1848 treaty, Mexico was forced to cede or give up roughly a third of its territory. They not only accepted the Rio Grande as the border with Texas and the United States, but Mexico also ceded virtually all of the territory to the west of Texas, including the current states of California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. All of this for a total of $15 million US. Many Americans protested against this war of conquest with Mexico. American transcendentalist philosopher Henry David Thoreau even went to jail for refusing to pay taxes to support the war effort. The war with Mexico poisoned relations between the two countries for decades afterwards. A year after the end of the Mexican War, President Polk negotiated a treaty with Great Britain to extend the U.S.-Canadian border across to the Pacific at the 49th parallel. Polk had previously, during the campaign for president, threatened war against Britain if Britain did not agree to the border at 54 degrees 40 minutes north instead of 49 degrees. His campaign slogan, 54-40 or fight, was so much hot air. Polk remembered what the British and Canadians had done to the Americans the last time America provoked a fight, and likely realized he could not fight both Mexico over Texas and the British over Oregon at the same time. The British were not too keen on war either, and the U.S. and Britain agreed to split the difference at the 49th parallel. This became the final border between the U.S. and Canada from the Pacific Ocean to the Great Lakes. The final piece of the U.S. continental puzzle was put in place in 1853. The U.S. purchased from Mexico a small slice of mostly uninhabited desert that became known as the Gadsden Purchase. The land was intended for a transcontinental railroad to the Pacific Ocean, but that railway was eventually built further to the north. The expansion of the United States was controversial. Many historians claim that the expansion aggravated tensions between the northern states and the southern states, as both disputed whether slavery should be permitted in the new territory. Most people understood that the deserts of Arizona and New Mexico were unlikely places for plantation agriculture to succeed, but the Northern Whig Party that would later morph into the Republican Party was determined to keep all blacks, free and slave, out of the new territory. In addition, much of the expansion came at the expense of Mexico, and relations between the U.S. and Mexico have been rocky ever since. Finally, the Indians and Americans of Mexican descent often found themselves deprived of their rights and property in the newly acquired territories. American expansion or imperialism did not end with reaching the Pacific Ocean either. The U.S. would later conquer Hawaii and wage war against Spain to acquire the Philippines and other possessions overseas. The U.S. also continues to build a less formal military empire, invading other nations and subverting native governments. One has to wonder here, are the U.S. latest invasions and wars an anomaly, something unusual, or just part of a continuing pattern of behavior that stretches back to the violent beginnings of the American Republic during the Revolutionary War?